Get this woman out of my courtroom before I have her arrested for impersonating an attorney.
Those 11 words would end Judge Charles Donovan's 30-year career, though he had no idea as he spat them across the marble chamber. Rebecca Lawson stood at the defense table in her Navy power suit, her briefcase still open beside her, the pearl studs in her ears catching the cold light from the chandelier above. She did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She simply tilted her head slightly, the way a chess player does when she sees 3 moves ahead and her opponent does not. The courtroom was packed that Tuesday morning. United States District Courthouse, Eastern District, Courtroom 4B, a chamber so ornate it looked more like a cathedral than a place of law. Reporters lined the back rows. 2 rows of law students from the local university filled the gallery, notebooks open, phones discreetly recording from inside open handbags. Rebecca's client, a black software engineer named Marcus Whitfield, sat beside her in a charcoal suit, accused of a wire fraud he did not commit. He looked up at his attorney with eyes that asked the only question that mattered. "Are we going to be okay?" Rebecca did not answer him. She turned slowly toward the bench, toward the man in the black robe whose face had gone the color of raw meat, and she said in a voice that was steadier than the silence around it, "Your Honor, with respect, I was midway through opening arguments. The defense has the right under the 6th Amendment to present its case without interruption. I would ask the court to permit me to continue." Judge Charles Donovan leaned forward. He was 63 years old, salt and pepper hair combed back from a forehead that had begun glistening with sweat. He had presided over this courthouse for 3 decades. His name was on a brass plaque in the lobby. His portrait hung in the judge's dining room. He had buried 2 wives and outlived his own father, and in all those years no one, not one person, had ever spoken to him in his own courtroom the way this woman was speaking to him now. "Counsel," he said, his voice climbing, "I do not know where you were trained to practice law, but in my courtroom, when the bench speaks, you sit down. Do you understand the English language, Miss Lawson? Or shall I have someone translate for you?" A ripple went through the gallery. A young woman in the 3rd row covered her mouth. One of the law students lifted her phone an inch higher. In the jury box, juror number 4, a retired postal worker named Mrs. Edwards, set down her water bottle very slowly, as if any sudden movement might break the moment open. Rebecca closed her briefcase with one quiet click. Inside it, pressed against the leather lining, was a Department of Justice credential wallet she had not yet had cause to produce. A gold badge with 3 letters embossed beneath the seal. OJC. Office of Judicial Conduct. She had been carrying it for 26 months. She had hoped, prayed even, that she would never have to draw it across this particular bench. But hope is a thin shield against a man who has spent 30 years believing he is untouchable. "Your Honor," she said, "I understand the English language perfectly. I graduated from Yale Law School. I clerked on the Second Circuit. I have tried 47 federal cases. My accent, if that is what concerns the court, is from Charleston, South Carolina, where my mother was a public school teacher and my father was a Methodist preacher. I speak the same English you do." Judge Donovan's face went from red to purple. "Bailiff," he barked. The word cracked across the chamber like a rifle shot. "Bailiff, remove this woman from my courtroom. Now." Have you ever watched a man destroy his entire life in under 60 seconds? Watch closely. Because what happened next was filmed from 14 different angles, by phones, by the courtroom's own ceiling cameras, by a documentary crew that had been granted access that very morning to film a piece on federal jury selection. 14 angles. 14 recordings. 14 pieces of evidence that would, within 90 days, be played back to a panel of 7 federal judges convened to decide whether Charles Donovan would ever again wear that black robe. The bailiff, a broad-shouldered man named Officer Reyes, hesitated. He had worked this courtroom for 11 years. He had never been ordered to remove an attorney mid-argument. He looked at Rebecca. He looked at the judge. He took one step forward. "Officer Reyes," Rebecca said quietly, without turning her head, I'm not going to resist. But I want you to remember exactly what you saw here this morning. Every word. Every gesture. Because in about 1 hour, you are going to be asked to swear to it. She picked up her briefcase. She turned to Marcus Whitfield and whispered 7 words. Trust me. I am coming right back. Then she walked out of the courtroom on her own 2 feet, her head high, her heels clicking against the marble like a metronome counting down the final minutes of Judge Charles Donovan's career. The double doors of courtroom 4B swung shut behind Rebecca Lawson with a soft pneumatic hiss, the sound oddly gentle for a moment that had just shattered so many lives. Inside the chamber, Judge Charles Donovan exhaled with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had just restored order. He smoothed his robe. He took a sip of water from the crystal glass at his right hand. He glanced at the jury box and offered the 12 confused citizens what he believed was a reassuring smile. My apologies for that unfortunate disruption, he said, his voice now smooth as church silk. We will take a brief recess while the defendant secures appropriate counsel. Court is adjourned for 1 hour. He brought his gavel down once, the sound flat and final, and stepped down from the bench with the unhurried gait of a man who had won. He did not look at Marcus Whitfield, who was sitting alone now at the defense table, his hands trembling against the polished wood. He did not look at the gallery, where a young black woman in a law school sweatshirt was openly weeping. He did not look at the documentary crew in the back corner, whose director, a veteran filmmaker named Daniel Chen, was quietly instructing his camera operators to keep rolling no matter what. In his private chambers behind the courtroom, Judge Donovan poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon from the crystal decanter on his sideboard. It was 9:47 in the morning. He did not care. He had earned this drink. He swirled the amber liquid in the glass and walked to the window overlooking the Federal Plaza. Down below, on the wide stone steps, he could see a woman in a navy suit walking calmly toward the parking garage. He smiled. Good riddance, he muttered. His clerk, a young man named Andrew Pierce, was standing in the corner of the chambers near the bookshelves. Andrew was 26 years old, with sandy brown hair and skin the color of pale honey, eyes that were a striking hazel green. He had been clerking for Judge Donovan for 14 months. He had not said a single word since the moment his uncle ordered Rebecca Lawson removed from the courtroom. He stood very still, holding a stack of case files against his chest, and watched the back of his uncle's head with an expression no one in that room would have been able to read. Andrew, Judge Donovan said without turning. Get me the Whitfield file. I want to review the prosecution's evidence one more time before we resume. And call down to chambers and have Judge Patterson cover my afternoon docket. I've had enough excitement for one morning. Yes, sir, Andrew said quietly. His voice cracked slightly on the second word. His uncle did not notice. Andrew walked to the desk, set down the files, and slipped out of chambers through the side door that led to the clerk's corridor. He walked 15 steps down the hallway. He stopped in front of a window. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass. And for the first time in 2 years, he allowed himself to cry. Andrew Pierce was Charles Donovan's nephew. His mother was Charles's younger sister, Diane, a woman who had married a black engineer named Robert Pierce in 1996, a marriage that her brother Charles had refused to attend, refused to acknowledge, and refused to mention for the next 19 years. When Diane died of breast cancer in 2015, Charles had attended the funeral. He had stood at the back of the church. He had not spoken to Andrew, then 16 years old, who sat in the front pew holding his father's hand. 6 years later, when Andrew graduated from Georgetown Law near the top of his class, his father had quietly suggested that perhaps reconciliation with his uncle might be possible. Andrew had reached out. Charles, surprisingly, had responded warmly. There was a position opening for a clerk in his chambers. Family was family, after all. For 14 months, Andrew had sat in this very corridor and listened to his uncle's voice through the chamber doors. He had heard him refer to black defendants as those people. He had heard him mock the names of Latino attorneys. He had watched him deny continuances to lawyers with accents and grant them to lawyers from his country club. He had stayed because he was gathering evidence. He had stayed because somewhere in a sealed binder, 20 miles away in a federal office building, a special counsel he had never met by name was building a case. He had stayed because his mother had taught him that the worst thing in the world was a witness who chose silence. Andrew wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He pulled out his phone. He typed one short message and pressed send. The message read simply, "It happened. She's on her way to you now." He put the phone in his pocket, straightened his tie, and walked back into the chambers to pour his uncle a second glass of bourbon. Charles Donovan would need it. Down below, in the parking garage, Rebecca Lawson was already starting her engine. Rebecca Lawson drove through downtown traffic with both hands on the steering wheel and the radio off. Outside her windshield, the city moved in its ordinary rhythm. A delivery truck pulled into a loading dock. A woman walked a beagle across a crosswalk. A construction crane swung a steel beam against a winter-gray sky. The world had no idea that in the next 60 minutes, a 30-year federal judicial career was about to be ended forever, and Rebecca was the woman driving toward the end of it. Her phone, mounted on the dashboard, vibrated softly. A text message lit up the screen. She glanced at it, read the 7 words, and allowed herself one slow exhale. Asterisk it happened. She's on her way to you now, asterisk she did not reply. She had told Andrew Pierce months ago, the only time the two of them had ever met in person, in a coffee shop 40 miles from the courthouse, that there would be no replies. No traceable communication. No digital fingerprints. Just one signal, sent once, on the morning the trap finally closed. She thought about Andrew now as she drove. 26 years old. Honey-skinned. Hazel green eyes. His mother's son in almost every visible way except for the slight tilt of his chin, which had come from the Donovan side of the family and which his uncle had probably never noticed. Andrew had walked into her temporary office in the federal building 17 months ago, set a manila envelope on her desk, and said only, "My uncle is a federal judge. I have been keeping records. I want you to make him stop." Then he had walked out without giving his name. The envelope had contained 11 pages of transcribed comments, dated and time-stamped, every one of them a blade. Have you ever wondered what it takes for a person to turn against their own blood? It takes love. It takes a mother who taught you that silence is its own kind of violence. And it takes watching your uncle, the man whose portrait hangs in the lobby of a federal courthouse, lean back in his leather chair and laugh at the name Jamal. Rebecca pulled into the underground parking lot of the federal building at 9:53. She did not take the public elevator. She walked to the secure stairwell at the back of the garage, swiped her badge against the reader, and climbed 3 flights to the 7th floor. The Office of Judicial Conduct occupied the north wing. Most days the door read simply OJC in small brass letters. Most days no one paid it any attention. Today, the door was already open. Standing just inside were 2 United States Marshals in their dark suits, their badges visible on their belts. Behind them, in a tailored gray suit and a string of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother, stood Chief Judge Eleanor Vance. 68 years old. First black woman to preside over the Eastern District. 22 years on the federal bench. She had been waiting for this morning for 2 long years, and her face showed nothing but the calm of a woman who had finally heard the alarm she had been listening for. "Rebecca," Chief Judge Vance said, holding out both hands. "Tell me everything." Rebecca did not waste a syllable. 9:31 this morning. Donovan interrupted my opening argument in the Whitfield case. He mocked my command of the English language. He asked, on the record, whether I required a translator. When I cited the 6th Amendment, he ordered the bailiff to remove me. There are at least 14 recordings. The documentary crew Daniel Chen has been filming for the National Endowment was in the back of the courtroom. Chief Judge Vance closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them, she was already moving. Marshal Davis. Marshal O'Brien. You will accompany Special Counsel Lawson and myself back to courtroom 4B in 24 minutes. Rebecca, retrieve the binder. Rebecca walked to the wall safe behind her desk. She knelt down. She entered the 8-digit code that only 3 people in the building knew. The lock clicked. She lifted out a heavy black binder, 3 inches thick, the spine marked only with a case number and the word sealed, for judicial review. Inside were 14 verified misconduct complaints from 14 attorneys spanning 8 years. 21 transcript excerpts. Sworn affidavits from 6 former clerks, 2 of them now sitting federal judges themselves. 3 audio recordings made lawfully in chambers, the kind of recordings only an inside witness with the right access could ever obtain. And bound into the back cover, in a sealed envelope marked confidential informant, the original 11 pages Andrew Pierce had set on her desk 17 months ago. She stood up. She turned to Chief Judge Vance. It's all here. Every page. Every recording. Every signature. Chief Judge Vance took the binder in both hands. She held it the way a priest holds a chalice. Then let us go, she said quietly, and give that man the only thing he has ever truly earned. The 4 of them walked out together into the bright cold morning. The clock on the dashboard read 10:07. They had 53 minutes until court resumed. While Rebecca Lawson and Chief Judge Eleanor Vance moved through the federal building with the slow purpose of a tide coming in, Judge Charles Donovan sat in his chambers and lifted his second bourbon to his lips. The clock on the wall above his diplomas read 10:11. He felt magnificent. He felt, in a way he had not felt in years, fully himself. He thought about Rebecca Lawson and almost laughed. The audacity of that woman. Walking into his courtroom in those expensive earrings and that crisp suit, talking about Yale Law School as if a degree erased a place of origin. Charleston, she had said. Methodist preacher's daughter. He had pegged her the moment she stood up. He had been pegging women like her his entire career, ever since his first year on the bench in 1995, when a similar woman had stood before him in this very chamber and he had learned, by accident at first and then by deliberate practice, how easy it was to break them down without ever leaving a single ruling that could be appealed. A sigh of impatience here. A raised eyebrow there. A reference to command of the language. A continuance denied for reasons that sounded almost reasonable on paper. For 30 years, he had ridden that quiet skill like a man riding a current downstream. Other judges retired. Other judges were censured. Judge Charles Donovan kept his bench, kept his portrait in the lobby, kept his table at the country club where the membership was 96% white and the bartender knew his drink. He had been promoted to senior judge in 2012. He had been invited to lecture at 3 law schools. The American Bar Association had given him a certificate of distinguished service in 2018. The certificate hung above his desk now, between his Yale diploma and a framed photograph of himself shaking hands with a former president. A soft knock came at the chamber door. "Come," he said. Andrew Pierce stepped inside. He had recovered from his moment in the corridor. His face was composed. He carried a fresh pot of coffee on a silver tray, a habit he had begun in his second week as clerk and which his uncle had come to expect. He set the tray on the sideboard. He poured a cup. He set it on the desk in front of his uncle without a word. "Andrew." Judge Donovan leaned back in his chair and gestured with his bourbon glass. "Sit down a moment. I want to talk to you." Andrew sat in the leather chair across the desk. He folded his hands in his lap. His uncle studied him for a long moment with the same hazel green eyes Andrew had inherited from his mother. "You're going to be a fine judge one day, Andrew. I've watched you these past months. You have the temperament. You have the mind. And you have something else. Something I think a lot of these young people coming out of law school don't have anymore. You have judgment." Judge Donovan tapped his temple with one finger. "Up here. Where it counts. "Thank you, sir," Andrew said quietly. "This morning. What you saw out there. You understand what was happening, don't you? That woman, Miss Lawson, she came into my courtroom looking for a fight. They do that now. They go to these elite schools and they come out thinking that the rules don't apply to them. That they can walk into a federal courtroom and lecture a sitting judge about the Sixth Amendment. The Sixth Amendment, Andrew. As if I haven't been ruling on Sixth Amendment questions since before she was born." Andrew said nothing. He was looking at a small chip in the rim of the coffee cup he had just placed on the desk. He focused on the chip. He kept his face perfectly still. "You and I, Andrew, we have to hold the line. That's what this job is. Holding the line. Because if we don't, what happens to the law? What happens to this institution?" Judge Donovan took another sip of his bourbon and gestured vaguely at the bookshelves around them, the leather-bound volumes of federal case reporters going back to 1789. "We have to remember who we are." "Yes, sir," Andrew said. His voice did not crack this time. He had used up his crying. "Good man." Judge Donovan smiled. He stood up. He walked around the desk and clapped his nephew on the shoulder. The hand rested there a moment, paternal, proud. "You're a Donovan, Andrew. Whatever else you are. You're a Donovan. Don't ever forget that." Andrew looked up at his uncle's face. He held the older man's gaze for a long, level moment. Then he said, very softly, "I won't, sir. I promise." Judge Donovan, who had heard exactly what he wanted to hear, did not catch the second meaning underneath the first. He squeezed his nephew's shoulder once more and walked back to his desk to enjoy the rest of his bourbon. In the lobby downstairs, the elevator doors opened. 4 people stepped out. The clock above the courthouse entrance struck 10:32. The 4 of them moved through the marble lobby of the federal courthouse in a tight diamond formation, with Chief Judge Eleanor Vance at the point and Rebecca Lawson one step behind her, the 2 United States Marshals flanking them like dark-suited bookends. Chief Judge Vance carried nothing in her hands. Rebecca carried the heavy black binder pressed against her hip, her grip steady. The Marshals carried, on their belts beneath their suit jackets, the quiet authority of the federal government of the United States of America. Heads turned. They turned the way heads turn when something extraordinary is about to happen in a place where extraordinary things do not usually happen. A paralegal coming out of the cafeteria with a styrofoam cup of soup froze in mid-step and watched them pass. A pair of public defenders in cheap suits, arguing in low voices near the directory, fell silent and stared. An older woman in a janitorial uniform pushing a cleaning cart stopped and pressed herself against the wall and watched Chief Judge Vance walk by, and the older woman, whose name was Loretta and who had been mopping these floors for 19 years, felt something rise up in her chest that she would later describe to her daughter as the feeling of finally seeing the wind change direction. Word travels through a courthouse the way fire travels through dry grass. By the time the 4 of them reached the south stairwell, 3 text messages had already gone out from 3 different phones. The first text reached the desk of a court reporter named Diane Cooper, who was on her 10:30 break and who immediately stood up, gathered her steno equipment, and walked very fast toward courtroom 4B. The second reached a reporter from the city paper who had been loitering in the press room hoping for something better than the zoning hearing he was supposed to cover. The third reached the chambers of Judge Patterson, who had been told by Judge Donovan that he would need to cover the afternoon docket, and who now sat at his desk reading the message twice and then a third time and then quietly closing the file in front of him and reaching for his own black robe. Inside courtroom 4B, the recess had stretched into its 43rd minute. The jury had been led to the deliberation room. The gallery, however, had not emptied. Most of the spectators had simply stayed in their seats, sensing without being able to articulate it that something was not finished. Marcus Whitfield sat alone at the defense table. A young court-appointed attorney had been sent in to sit beside him as a placeholder, a tired-looking man in his 50s named Mr. Henley who carried the soft odor of stale coffee and who had patted Marcus's arm exactly once and said, "Son, sometimes you just have to let the judge be the judge." Marcus had not responded. He was looking at the carved wooden door at the back of the courtroom. He was watching it the way a man in a storm watches the horizon for the first break in the clouds. In the third row of the gallery, Daniel Chen sat with his documentary crew. 2 cameras. 3 audio recorders. He had spent his career making documentaries about systems. About how systems work and how they fail and how, very rarely, they correct themselves. He had been granted access to this courtroom for one purpose only, to film a piece on federal jury selection. He had walked in this morning expecting nothing more interesting than a panel of jurors being questioned about their commute times. He had walked in expecting wallpaper, and he had been handed lightning. He kept his cameras running. He did not blink. In the back row, a young black woman in a law school sweatshirt sat next to her mother. The young woman's name was Tamika. She was a second-year law student. Her mother had insisted on coming today, had taken the day off from her job at the hospital to watch her daughter watch a real federal trial, and now her mother sat with her hand wrapped around her daughter's hand, the way she had held her daughter's hand at the children's hospital 12 years ago when Tamika had broken her arm falling off a swing. The mother had not seen what had happened in this courtroom today. She had only felt it. And she was holding her daughter's hand the way you hold the hand of someone who is about to remember a moment for the rest of her life. In his chambers, Judge Charles Donovan finished his bourbon. He set the glass down on his desk. He stood up. He looked at himself for a long moment in the antique mirror that hung beside the window, and what he saw there pleased him. A serious face. A serious robe. A serious man. He smoothed the front of his robe with both hands. He walked to the chamber door that led back into the courtroom. He placed his hand on the brass handle. In the corridor outside the main entrance of courtroom 4B, 4 people stopped walking. Chief Judge Vance turned to Rebecca and said one word. "Ready." Rebecca said, "Yes, Your Honor." Marshal Davis stepped forward and put his hand on the carved wooden door. The door to courtroom 4B opened at exactly the moment Judge Charles Donovan stepped out from his chambers behind the bench. The timing was so perfect it would later be described, by the documentary filmmaker Daniel Chen, as one of those moments in history when 2 separate hands reach for the same doorknob from opposite sides without either knowing the other is there. Donovan's right foot came down on the carpeted dais at the same instant the courtroom's main door swung wide. He looked up. He saw the marshals first. 2 men in dark suits. Federal badges visible at the waist. His brain registered the marshals before it registered the woman in pearls beside them, and so for one full second he simply stood there, frozen halfway between his chair and his gavel, trying to remember whether he had been told that marshals would be attending court today. Then he saw Chief Judge Eleanor Vance. The color drained from his face the way water drains from a cracked basin. Slowly at first. Then all at once. Then he saw, one step behind her, Rebecca Lawson in her navy suit, the heavy black binder pressed against her hip. Judge Donovan opened his mouth. No sound came out. Chief Judge Vance walked up the center aisle with the slow, measured pace of a woman who had waited too long to hurry the last 20 feet. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at Marcus Whitfield. She did not look at the bailiff or the stenographer or the documentary cameras tracking her every step. She looked only at the man on the dais, and her eyes held the kind of weight that very old institutions carry when they finally decide to act. She stopped at the wooden rail that separated the gallery from the well of the court. She placed her hands lightly on the railing. "Judge Donovan," she said. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. The chamber was so silent that her words traveled into every corner of it without effort. "Please remain where you are." Judge Donovan's hand, still hovering near his gavel, dropped slowly to his side. "Eleanor," he said. He tried to smile. The smile did not arrive. "Chief Judge Vance. I was not aware you would be visiting this morning. Is there a matter I can assist you with?" "Yes, Charles. There is." Chief Judge Vance turned slightly and looked toward the back of the courtroom. Marshal Davis closed the heavy wooden door behind them. The latch clicked into place with a small, final sound. Then Marshal O'Brien stepped forward and stood at parade rest beside the prosecution's table. Marshal Davis stepped forward and stood beside the defense table. Neither man drew a weapon. Neither man needed to. Their presence in those two specific positions, flanking the well of the court, was a kind of sentence in itself, and Judge Donovan, who had spent 30 years reading sentences, understood it instantly. His knees, very faintly, began to tremble beneath his robe. Chief Judge Vance lifted a single sheet of paper that she had carried folded in the pocket of her suit. She unfolded it deliberately, smoothing the crease with one thumb. She put on a pair of slim reading glasses. She began to read aloud. By order of the Judicial Council of the Federal Circuit, this court, upon credible and verified evidence of repeated and severe judicial misconduct, hereby suspends the Honorable Charles W. Donovan from all judicial duties, with immediate effect, pending the formal commencement of impeachment proceedings before the United States House of Representatives. The suspension order is signed by myself as Chief Judge of this district, by the Chief Judge of the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, and countersigned by the Director of the Office of Judicial Conduct. She lowered the paper. She removed her glasses. "Charles," she said, and now her voice was quiet, almost gentle, the voice you might use with a man at a funeral, "you are to step down from that bench. You are to surrender your robe to the marshals. And you are to leave this courtroom by the public exit. Do you understand the order I have just read?" Judge Donovan did not move. His mouth opened. His mouth closed. He looked down at the gavel beside his hand. He looked at the high carved back of the chair he had occupied for 30 years. He looked at the brass nameplate on the front of the bench, the one that read simply HON, Charles W. Donovan, U.S. District Judge. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice had gone hoarse, "there must be some kind of mistake. I have been a federal judge for 30 years. I have a distinguished record. I have, Charles." Chief Judge Vance did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Step down. Now." In the back of the gallery, Daniel Chen's cameras were rolling. In the front row, Marcus Whitfield had stood up without realizing he had done so. In the side door near the bailiff's desk, Andrew Pierce had stepped quietly into the courtroom and stopped, his hands folded in front of him, his hazel-green eyes fixed on his uncle's face. Judge Donovan, very slowly, reached up and began to untie his robe. Judge Charles Donovan's hands trembled as he worked the small black fasteners at the throat of his robe. He had put this robe on every working morning for 3 decades. He had put it on when his first wife was dying, and on the morning of his second wife's funeral, and on the morning after his only son had told him over the telephone that he no longer wished to speak to him. The robe had been his armor through all of it. The fabric was heavier than people realized. It was wool, lined in silk. It had been tailored for him in 1995 by a small shop in Washington that specialized in judicial garments, and over the years he had grown into it the way a turtle grows into its shell. His fingers fumbled. The top fastener slipped from his grip twice. On the third try he got it free. He worked his way down. 5 fasteners in total. With each one the robe loosened around him a little more. With each one he seemed to grow physically smaller, his shoulders narrowing, his height diminishing, until by the time the last fastener was undone he looked less like a federal judge than like a frightened 63-year-old man wearing a black wool coat that no longer fit him. He slid the robe from his shoulders. He stood there in his white shirt and dark gray slacks and the wide blue silk tie his second wife had bought him the Christmas before she died. He held the robe in both hands. He did not seem to know what to do with it. Marshal O'Brien stepped forward. "I'll take that, sir," he said quietly, not unkindly. He held out one open hand. Judge Donovan placed the folded robe across the marshal's forearm. The marshal accepted it the way a footman accepts a coat in a hotel lobby. Then Marshal O'Brien stepped back to his position, the robe draped neatly over his arm, and the formal symbol of Charles Donovan's authority passed out of Charles Donovan's possession forever. It was at that exact moment that Donovan's eyes, scanning the courtroom in something close to panic, found Andrew. Andrew was standing very still beside the bailiff's desk. His arms were folded loosely in front of him. His face was calm. He was looking directly at his uncle, and the look on his face was not triumph and not anger but something much harder to bear, a kind of steady and terrible patience, the look of a person who has been waiting a very long time to be seen. Judge Donovan stared at his nephew. His mouth opened slightly. His brain, working slowly through the bourbon and the shock, began to assemble pieces that had been lying scattered in his life for months. The clerk who was always in the chambers. The clerk who always brought the coffee. The clerk who had access to every transcript, every recording, every internal email. The clerk who, 2 weeks ago, had asked permission to make a duplicate set of the chamber's schedule for, he had said, his own organizational purposes. Andrew. The name came out of Donovan's mouth as something between a question and a prayer. Andrew did not answer. He simply continued to look at his uncle with the same steady gaze. Andrew, you didn't. Andrew said nothing. He did not have to. Have you ever watched a man understand, in real time, that the person who destroyed him was the person he had trusted most? Watch Charles Donovan now. Watch his face. Watch the slow way his expression collapses from outrage into confusion into disbelief into something that finally, after a long moment, settles into the dull and hollow weight of recognition. His own sister's son. The boy whose mother he had not buried properly. The boy whose father he had not spoken to in 27 years. The boy he had called, just 9 minutes ago in his chambers, a Donovan. His knees gave way. He did not fall. The high judicial chair caught him from behind, and he sank into it heavily, his hands gripping the polished wooden arms. From the gallery it looked, for one strange moment, as though he were taking his seat to begin court. But there was no robe on his shoulders, and no gavel in his hand, and the woman now standing in the well of the court was Chief Judge Eleanor Vance, who turned now to address the chamber for the first time as its presiding officer. This court, she said, her voice carrying without strain to every corner of the room, stands in recess. The criminal trial of Mr. Marcus Whitfield is hereby continued and reassigned. The defense will receive a new trial date within 10 business days under a new presiding judge. Mr. Whitfield, you and your counsel are free to leave. Mr. Henley, thank you for your service this morning. You are excused. Marcus Whitfield sat down very slowly. He put both hands flat on the table in front of him. He looked over at Rebecca Lawson, who had not yet spoken since she walked through the door, and tears were running freely down his face. Rebecca looked back at him. She gave him one small, steady nod. The first nod said, "I told you I was coming back." Marshal Davis approached the bench from the left side, his movements unhurried but deliberate. He stopped at the small wooden gate that opened onto the dais, the gate that for 30 years had separated Charles Donovan's seat of power from the rest of the world, and he opened it now with one quiet push. "Judge Donovan," he said, and there was no contempt in his voice, only the practiced neutrality of a man who had escorted many people out of many rooms. "Sir, it's time to go." Charles Donovan did not look at him. He was still looking at Andrew. His hands gripped the arms of the chair so tightly that the knuckles had gone white. For one long moment it seemed possible that he might refuse to move, that he might simply sit there in that high carved chair and force them to lift him out of it like a piece of furniture. But Charles Donovan had been a federal judge for 3 decades, and somewhere underneath all the bourbon and the disgrace there remained a flicker of the man who had once cared about the dignity of the bench. He did not want to be carried out of his own courtroom. He stood up. He stepped down from the dais. One step. Then another. The dais had 3 steps and he descended them slowly, holding the brass railing with one shaking hand. When his foot touched the carpet of the well of the court, Marshal Davis fell in beside him on the left. Marshal O'Brien, still carrying the folded robe across his forearm, fell in on the right. And the three of them began the long walk down the center aisle of courtroom 4B. The gallery was silent. Nobody applauded. Nobody booed. Nobody whispered. The hush in the room was the hush of a congregation watching something it would speak about for the rest of its life. Daniel Chen's two cameras tracked the slow procession from the front and from above, the lens at the back of the room catching the entire chamber in one wide, steady frame. As Donovan passed the third row of the gallery, he turned his head slightly. He found Andrew again, who had quietly moved to stand at the end of that row, his arms still folded, his face still composed. The two men's eyes met for the second time. Donovan's mouth worked. He produced no words. Andrew gave his uncle the smallest possible nod. Not of triumph. Not of forgiveness. Of acknowledgement only. I see you. I have always seen you. Now you see me too. Charles Donovan looked away first. He walked the remaining length of the aisle with his eyes on the wooden door at the back of the courtroom. When he reached it, Marshal O'Brien stepped forward and opened it for him. Donovan paused on the threshold. He did not look back. He simply walked through, and the door swung shut behind him, and that was the last time Charles Donovan would ever stand inside courtroom 4B. In the well of the court, Chief Judge Eleanor Vance turned to face the gallery. She placed both hands on the railing of the empty bench behind her, anchoring herself the way a captain anchors herself at the wheel of a ship. This courthouse, she said, her voice carrying clearly, operates on a single promise. That every person who walks through its doors will be treated equally under the law. That promise has been broken in this room many times over many years. As of this morning, the breaking has stopped. She paused. She allowed her gaze to move across the gallery, lingering for a moment on Tamika and her mother, on Marcus Whitfield, on Daniel Chen's documentary cameras, and finally on Rebecca Lawson, who stood quietly in the well with the heavy black binder still pressed against her hip. Special Counsel Lawson has worked on this matter for 26 months. The full record of Judge Donovan's conduct will be made public in due course, in the form and at the time required by law. Until then, this district will continue its business with new judges, fair hearings, and the steady restoration of public trust. She lifted one hand in a small gesture toward the bailiff. Court is adjourned. The bailiff, Officer Reyes, raised his voice for the first time that morning. All rise. The gallery rose as one. Chief Judge Vance turned and walked off the dais, not up to the bench but around it, exiting through the side door that led to the corridor of judges' chambers. The two marshals remained in the well of the court, awaiting their next instructions. Rebecca Lawson stood very still for a long moment. Then she walked over to the defense table, where Marcus Whitfield was still sitting with both hands flat against the wood. She set the heavy black binder down on the table beside him. She took the chair next to his, the chair she had been removed from less than 2 hours earlier, and she sat down in it. She turned to her client. Now, she said quietly. Let's talk about your case. Marcus Whitfield, for the first time in 11 months, began to laugh and cry at the same time. The story of what happened in courtroom 4B that Tuesday morning did not stay inside the courthouse for long. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Daniel Chen had quietly transferred the day's footage from his cameras onto 3 separate encrypted hard drives and placed 2 of those drives in 2 separate bank deposit boxes. By 3 o'clock, the first short clip, just 41 seconds of audio in which Judge Donovan's voice could be heard asking Rebecca Lawson whether she required a translator, had been uploaded to a major news outlet's verified social media account. By 5 o'clock, the clip had been viewed 2 million times. By the following morning, it had been viewed 30 million times. The reaction came in waves. The first wave was the simple shock of the recording itself, a sitting federal judge speaking those words in open court, on the record, with multiple witnesses. The second wave came when people began to learn what had happened in the following hour, that Rebecca Lawson had not been a private attorney humiliated and dismissed but rather a special counsel for the Office of Judicial Conduct who had walked back into that courtroom with the suspension order already prepared. The third wave, which built more slowly but lasted longer than any of the others, came as the first of 14 other attorneys began to speak publicly about their own experiences in Judge Donovan's courtroom over the previous 15 years. A woman named Maria Delgado, an immigration attorney from the eastern part of the district, gave the first on-camera interview. She had appeared before Judge Donovan in 2017 in a routine asylum case. She described the way he had repeated her client's name 3 times in 3 different mispronunciations, each one more theatrical than the last, until the gallery began to laugh. She had filed a complaint that year. The complaint had been dismissed as unfounded. She had carried the dismissal in a folder in her file cabinet for 8 years, she said, and she had taken the folder out of the cabinet last night and placed it on her kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. Then she had called the number listed on the Office of Judicial Conduct website. 3 other attorneys had called the same number that day. By the end of the week, the office had received 71 new calls. In a federal holding facility 40 miles west of the city, Charles Donovan sat on a metal cot in a small room that he had not yet been told whether to call a cell. He had not been arrested. The suspension was an administrative action, not a criminal one. But the criminal investigations were already beginning, and his attorney, a former colleague named Howard Briggs who had taken the case as a favor, had told him quietly that morning to prepare himself for the possibility of indictment on charges of civil rights violations under color of judicial authority, charges that carried, if proven, a sentence of up to 20 years. Charles Donovan had not spoken much since he had been escorted from his courtroom. He had refused dinner the night before. He had refused breakfast that morning. He sat on the cot with his hands folded in his lap and stared at a point on the gray concrete wall opposite him, and the point on the wall was, in his mind, his nephew's face. Andrew Pierce, meanwhile, had been moved into protective administrative leave from the federal judiciary. He had given his first formal deposition that afternoon, in a conference room on the 7th floor of the federal building, with Rebecca Lawson seated beside him and a stenographer recording every word. Andrew had spoken for 4 hours. He had described the dinners at his uncle's house where he had been the only person of color at the table. He had described the comments his uncle had made in chambers when he believed Andrew was not listening. He had described the moment in his second month as clerk, when his uncle had referred to a black defense attorney as one of those people and then turned to Andrew and said, without irony, no offense, of course, son. You know I don't mean people like you, Andrew had described that moment slowly, his voice steady. Then he had asked for a glass of water. Then he had continued. 3 months later, he would repeat the same testimony, under oath, before the House Judiciary Committee at Charles Donovan's impeachment hearing. Cameras from every major network would be in the room. His father, Robert Pierce, would sit in the gallery directly behind him, and at one point during a long pause in the questioning, Andrew would turn his head slightly and meet his father's eyes, and his father would lift one hand and place it briefly over his heart. The 432 cases Charles Donovan had presided over in his final 5 years on the bench were ordered reviewed by a special judicial panel. Marcus Whitfield's wire fraud charges were dismissed 11 days after his original trial, when prosecutors quietly acknowledged that the case had been built on faulty evidence that Judge Donovan had previously refused to suppress. Marcus Whitfield walked out of the federal courthouse a free man. He walked out with Rebecca Lawson beside him. 6 months after the morning that ended Charles Donovan's career, the federal courthouse where it had all happened looked, on the surface, almost unchanged. The marble lobby still gleamed under the same chandeliers. The brass directory still listed the same courtrooms. The portraits of former judges still hung in their gilt frames along the second-floor corridor, although one frame, the one that had held the official portrait of the Honorable Charles W. Donovan, had been quietly emptied and removed to a storage room in the basement, where it would remain until a committee decided whether to leave the space permanently blank or to commission a new portrait of a different jurist for the wall. The changes that mattered, the changes that ran deeper than paint and brass, were happening in the rooms behind those marble walls. A new mandatory training program on implicit bias had been instituted for every federal judge in the district, designed in part by Rebecca Lawson, who had been promoted to director of the Office of Judicial Conduct 2 months earlier. Every courtroom in the building had been outfitted with new audio recording equipment whose backup files could not be erased by anyone below the level of chief judge. A community oversight board, the first of its kind in the federal system, had been established by congressional authorization. 3 of its 9 seats were held by attorneys of color who had personally appeared before Charles Donovan. The first woman to chair the board was Maria Delgado, the immigration attorney whose complaint had once been dismissed as unfounded. Charles Donovan had been impeached by the House of Representatives by a vote of 393 to 11. He had been convicted by the Senate 3 weeks later. He had then been indicted in federal court on 12 counts of civil rights violations under color of judicial authority. He had pleaded guilty to 4 of the 12 in exchange for the dismissal of the remaining 8, and he had been sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. He was serving his time in a low-security facility in the western part of the state, where he spent most days reading the legal journals that still arrived in his name and to which he could no longer contribute a single ruling. His nephew, Andrew Pierce, had taken a new position as a staff attorney at a civil rights nonprofit in the same city. He had moved out of his small apartment near the courthouse and into a larger one closer to his father, with whom he now had dinner every Sunday. The dinners were quiet, and they often involved his mother's old recipes, and they were the most important hours of Andrew's week. Marcus Whitfield, whose dismissed wire fraud case had once threatened to send him to prison for 15 years, had founded a small consulting firm advising other engineers wrongly accused of corporate fraud. Rebecca Lawson sat on his advisory board. She had attended the opening reception of his new offices in a Navy power suit and the same pearl stud she had worn the morning she was thrown out of courtroom 4B. The documentary that Daniel Chen had originally been commissioned to make on federal jury selection had been quietly shelved by its production company and replaced by a different documentary, one that focused on a single morning in a single courtroom and the 26 months of patient investigation that had preceded it. It would win an Academy Award the following spring. Rebecca Lawson would attend the ceremony only because Andrew Pierce, who was her invited guest, had insisted that she come. She would wear a black gown. She would not give a speech. She would simply stand backstage and watch Daniel Chen accept the small gold statue, and afterward, walking back to the car together, she and Andrew would talk quietly about all the work that still remained to be done in courtrooms across the country that no documentary would ever film. Tamika, the second-year law student who had sat in the back row of the gallery that morning with her mother, would graduate the following May and accept a position as a federal public defender. The story she would tell her own children, many years later, about the moment that decided her career, would always begin in the same way. It would always begin with a woman in a navy suit walking back through a courthouse door. And in a quiet office on the 7th floor of the federal building, in a heavy black binder now archived in a permanent file, Rebecca Lawson kept a single sealed envelope. Inside the envelope were the 11 original pages that a young clerk had set on her desk 17 months before the morning everything changed. She kept the envelope not as evidence anymore, because the evidence had long since done its work, but as a reminder. A reminder that justice is built one witness at a time. A reminder that the people who break a system are almost never the people the system expects. If this story moved you, if you believe that every courtroom in this country should be a place where every person is treated equally under the law, take one moment now to like this video and share it with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of quiet courage and the people who refuse to look away. Leave a comment and tell us about the moment you decided to stand up. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And somewhere, right now, someone is waiting for the moment you decide to walk back through the door. Peace.